This is Skylar Fishman leading an open Q&A, and I have a review structured for you if you're not sure what to ask. All right. So what I have structured for you is I want to go over the big ideas, because I think when you understand how the different topics are integrated, how they relate to each other under these big ideas, the course is no longer so many millions of guests. Also have one question from somebody. Can we go over how to answer FRQ tips and tricks? From Celine. Absolutely. And I think if you'll go along with me here, you'll see that the whole thing is meant to set you up so that you can answer with appropriate vocabulary, with supporting details, that you make sure that you show enough of what you know to get good credit. Ooh, phosphorus cycle. I could throw that in there at some point. I will definitely talk about that in terms of biogeochemical cycles for sure. All right, so I'm going to say hello over here because you will most definitely get the most out of this is if you interrupt me and ask a lot of questions. I love live streaming, and I'm glad I convinced them to let me do one more review. It's really helpful. Oh, I can't see the chat for some reason. Okay. All right. It's really helpful if you guys ask for what you need, and that's how we're going to get the most out of this stream. Okay, so there are 4 big ideas that pull together all the topics. The first big idea I want to talk about is energy transfer, and this goes across so many units. Unit 1, 2, 3, 5, all of energy. All of it comes down to energy, and the source of all energy on Earth for producers is, anybody got it? I guess I can't really see the chat. I'm not really sure about that. Can somebody, let's see. Dakota, can you say something in the chat so I can see if it's actually working? Not sure if it's working. Okay, the source of energy on Earth for all producers is the sun. And so in Unit 1, we study photosynthesis, chemosynthesis, and the trophic pyramid, as well as the second law of thermodynamics, in order to be able to understand how that energy is stored in ecosystems, which will later help us understand why photosynthesis is such an important ecosystem service and why it's bad to cut down trees. So if you're asked, why is deforestation a problem? Well, it comes back to an understanding that photosynthesis stores solar energy in primary producers, passes that up the food chain. And this goes all the way into storing it as fossil fuels so that we can use it later. And the 10% rule, means that only 10% of that energy is passed up the chain. So why is it only 10%? Why is it so inefficient? And it gets to the second law of thermodynamics. So that's a good one to have on your cheat sheet, or not a cheat sheet, your reference guide. So energy cannot be created or destroyed. It has to go through a system and change form. And so in that chemical process, it's about 10% efficient. Your car, for example, when it burns phosphorus. I'm back. All right, what is chemosynthesis? Great question. Let me go back a slide. Well, I can do it from here. So photosynthesis is energy from the sun. Chemosynthesis happens deep in the oceans and in some volcanoes, places where the only thing available is chemical energy, and it involves hydrogen, dihydrogen sulfide instead of water. And the energy that is in those chemical bonds is then used to be stored in the form of glucose. So it looks like a photosynthesis equation, but it is in the absence of light. And not to give you too many details if you haven't learned it, I would just focus on the fact that the word chemo means chemical, like chemotherapy. We're using chemical bonds to get that energy. So not everything on Earth, not all living producers actually use the sun. Some can use chemicals through chemosynthesis. So hopefully that answers your question. And somebody's asked about research design on experimental FRQ, on experiment FRQs. Yes, I'm going to get to that in a little bit, but I can speak to it pretty quickly here, is that when you're a real scientist and you're about to do an experiment, you have to document what you're going to do so that either your faculty or your funder can understand exactly what you're planning on doing. So it's like a procedure in the sense that you want to include other people's experiments and research about those experiments in the design. So you say, I would probably look and see who else has done this experiment. I think that answers your question. I'm not really certain. Please ask it again. If you don't feel like it. It seems like I can't see the chat, so I'm going to ask that you guys ask these questions in the question and answer section. And so I've asked a question here that kind of gets to this big idea. Can you write out an equation for energy efficiency? And I don't expect that they're going to ask you to do any math, but I do expect that you would be asked how you would calculate energy efficiency, or perhaps you're going to do an experiment to determine what is the energy efficiency of photosynthesis in this particular ecosystem. Well, what are you going to do? How are you going to calculate that? You're going to have to calculate and measure the amount of solar energy coming into the ecosystem, and you're going to have to calculate and measure the amount of energy stored or going out. And just like when you drive a car and you talk about miles per gallon, energy efficiency is energy out over energy in. So it's energy out divided by energy. And I don't know why the chat's not working. Sorry about that. And so this big idea of energy transfer, it connects to Unit 5. It connects to meat production. Can you use the 10% rule to explain why it is more efficient to feed people a vegetarian diet? Remember, it's that 10%. So here, if we ask if there is 12,500 kilojoules of energy in producers in an ecosystem, how many kilojoules of energy are there in secondary consumers? Well, we have to move the decimal twice. So we go primary producers to primary consumers, and then we move the decimal place again, and we come up with 125 kilojoules. So that's 100 times less energy in those secondary consumers if we're eating meat. Now, most meat are primary consumers, so we're only losing 90%, right? But this was an FRQ question in the past, and I could see it bringing together these ideas of Unit 1 into our idea of land use. Why is there just not enough land use? Why is are just not enough land space or ecological footprint to be able to put a lot of ideas together and in detail that includes all the connections. So if you were asked this question, you want to be able to talk about the 10% rule and maybe even do the math. You don't have to show your work, but just explaining that it takes you lose 90%, explaining that 90% relates to the second law of thermodynamics. And how energy is lost because nothing is 100% efficient. And then explain that because we're going up this trophic pyramid, it's not efficient to eat beef. And I think that's the major mistake that most of my students make on FRQs is they don't include all the details. They don't ask themselves, and what, and what, and what. And so under this big idea also relates things that we learned in Unit 4. I'm going to check on these questions. Do you think we will make our own experiment or analyze a given experiment? I think probably both. Yes, I think I agree with Nina. I think probably both. I think because it's an FRQ, it's going to have multiple stages. It probably will start by giving you some data and giving you some context for you to pull in those scientific ideas from, you know, all of the units. And then they'll ask you, now you want to test this other thing. And how would you test this other thing? Or how would you move this experiment in a different direction? And then you'll sort of be designing from scratch. Hopefully that answers your question. Okay. So big idea number one, this energy transfer idea, it runs through a lot of units. One is Unit 4. Everything about Earth systems is driven by solar energy or by the energy of convection of the Earth's inner core. And so this idea that hot things rise, so that drives the tectonic plates. If you imagine that this was the magma underneath the lithosphere or the crust, that hotter magma heating up at the core rises and it moves underneath those plates, causing divergence, convergence, transform boundaries, shifting those cooler crusts around, and then colder magma sinks. This also explains movement of the global wind patterns. It also explains or maybe that the details underneath helps you get full credit. Because if you are asked to just say, why are there volcanic island arcs in the Pacific? And you say convection, or you say plate tectonics. Well, if they said identify, and that was the task verb, you're in good shape. If they said describe or explain, they want you to show an understanding of this earth science. For example, if we talk about why are the biomes at 30 degrees latitude, it has to do with the fact that hot air rises at the equator. So anybody, if I had the chat, then I would get you guys to answer these questions and it would be a little more useful for you. I'm so sorry. What kind of plate boundary is this? Where would you find it? Is it destroying or creating new crust? I'll give you a minute to think about it, even though I can't see the chat. So if you said divergent, you're absolutely correct. It's a divergent boundary. It's found mostly in mid-ocean ridges, so in the middle of the Atlantic and the middle of the Pacific. You do also see one up near Iceland, creating a rift valley. It is creating new crust, and that's what the ridge here, the mid-ocean ridge, is that magma coming up at the bottom of the ocean, creating new crust. And then again, still with this big idea, number one, of energy transfer. Energy convergence underlie all ecological processes. Energy cannot be created. It must come from somewhere. And so here, that energy is coming from the equator, where the sunlight is more direct. Air at the equator is warmer, so it rises. Water vapor condenses as it rises. When air expands and cools, it sinks, bringing dry air over this 30-degree latitude, which means we expect to have more deserts. And here you can see the Sahara Desert at that biome. So I would expect, again, if you're asked to describe how global wind patterns create biomes, that you would have a sentence that, a paragraph that was 2 to 3 sentences that put this together. Hot air at the equator rises because it's less dense. And that distribution of water vapor also explains why we have the intertropical convergence zone, and we have the rainforests of the world right around the equator, because as that air rises, it condenses, making it cloudy, making rainforests. So there's a lot of the Earth's condensed, evaporating condensed water raining down here in the intertropical convergence zone. Oh yes, I would love to explain the Hadley cell. So the Hadley cell starts at the equator because sunlight at the equator is always most direct at all times of year. Even with air, make convective clouds build during the afternoon because of that heat. Those two cells diverge from themselves because of the Coriolis force. So they don't just stay there. That air is carried north. And as it's carried north, the water vapor condenses, that air cools, and that colder air then sinks over 30 degrees. This and then pushes the air back to the equator, where it rises and diverges again. So because it's coming from both directions, we have two Hadley cells. We have a northern hemisphere Hadley cell and a southern hemisphere Hadley cell. And then you'd think that that would mean all the global winds would go north and south. But again, because the Earth is turning and the Coriolis force makes that look like, from our perspective, from the Earth, that they are turning into easterlies, which are also called the trade winds. So if you have a more specific question, if I did not get to that, did not really answer that, please put it in the questions. And then I have, do you think it's possible for there to be a Unit 4 FRQ since it's only experiment and solution? I absolutely think it's possible for there to be a Unit 4 FRQ, but I think it most likely would be about soils. So remember, weathering, erosion, soil composition, soil horizons, nutrient cycles in soil, because I think Unit 4 is what includes soils, and that relates to Unit 5, which includes agriculture and IPM. So I don't think you're going to see pose a solution about Unit 4. I don't think you're going to see an experimental design about global climate, because we didn't really get to Unit 9. So hopefully that answers your question. That's a really great question. Keep asking questions, guys, since I can't see the chat. And then finally, Unit 6, energy efficiency, also relates this idea of energy transfer together. So just like in ecosystems, we talked about how nothing is 100% efficient. We also talked in ecosystems about how fossil fuels are created. And nuclear energy, we need to understand how the core or the Earth's core works, and that we have radioactive elements that provide us with nuclear energy. So we understand now how these things are stored through the process of photosynthesis and then through geological processes that compress them, creating the sedimentary rock. And then we dig them up. And we also understand that that time scale is not sustainable. It's not renewable, really, because you could say, well, maybe more fossil fuels are being created in our generation. You know, maybe things are being fossilized. But because it takes hundreds of thousands to millions of years to form these things, and the fact that we're using them on the scale of hundreds of years, they are not renewable. And again, FRQ advice: don't answer a question that says explain or describe by saying it's energy, it's not a good source of energy because it's not renewable. We want you to be able to explain beyond a simple identify, right? So if it said identify a disadvantage of fossil fuels, yes, it's not renewable. Describe a disadvantage of fossil fuels. It's not renewable because geologic cycles, geologic time is so much longer, and we are using it so much faster. Same thing with groundwater, same thing with any renewable resource. Okay. Should we know about specific pollutants come from specific energy sources? I feel like that might be important for proposing a solution to an environmental problem. Sky, you are 100% dead on the money. I did not review air pollution here today. I know a teacher did a really good air pollution review yesterday, but I think you are looking for those connections, right? And so Unit 6 and Unit 7 are deeply connected to each other because it is our use of fossil fuels, petroleum, coal, and natural gas, that burning create carbon dioxide, which is a greenhouse gas and creates climate change. Don't just say it's a negative environmental impact as burning natural gas creates carbon dioxide. Say it creates carbon dioxide, which is a problem because it's a greenhouse gas, which leads to climate change. You want to go all the way. Ask yourself, and if. So obviously burning all of these or any kind of combustion, even burning wood, creates carbon dioxide. But coal in particular is very heavy in sulfur dioxide and nitrous oxide, so SOx and NOx, which lead to acid precipitation, petroleum as well, natural gas, and there are a lot of environmental problems with fracking. Should we also explain the effects of fossil fuel combustion on the carbon cycle if that is the case? Yeah, I mean, we're in the problem by planting trees. Could we plant enough trees to offset all of those carbon emissions? A lot of scientists recently are saying absolutely yes. So that is one option too, is let the carbon cycle help you understand how to propose a solution, okay? That was a great question, Tanya, thank you. Also, Sky has a question, when it comes to those problems, we can bring knowledge from other units, even if they aren't on the test, like global change connections in Unit 9. Absolutely. I think the thing as an environmental scientist and teacher of environmental science that becomes frustrating is we have these units that have all this information, and we have to break them up into units so we can kind of give you some synthesis as we go along. But as we go along, everything becomes more and more and more connected. And so the fact that we didn't get to do Unit 8 and Unit 9, I think is really frustrating a lot of teachers. And certainly if you were able to synthesize some of that stuff you learned about aquatic biomes in Unit 1, with some of the things you know about water pollution, great. If you're able to synthesize what you learned about the carbon cycle and the climate system in Unit 1 and Unit 4 with some things about Unit 9, great. You want to, if you have your notes on every different kind of page, it may help you if you kind of draw arrows from one page to the next, or at least give yourself some arrows that connect things. That's why I wanted to give you this idea of energy transfer as a way that connects almost all the units. I would say populations could be connected, but we're not going to talk about that. I would pigeonhole yourself. Like when you see a question, don't think, oh, this is a Unit 7 question. This is about air pollution. It's going to be an air pollution question. It's going to be a population question. It's going to be probably a question about energy efficiency or energy use. It's going to be a question about sustainable cities or urban development or transit-oriented development. So that your ability to make connections will be helpful to you. When we talk about energy efficiency in terms of energy resources, we talked also about economic advantages and disadvantages and cost per kilowatt. We also talk about something called EROI, or energy returned on energy investment, which means it takes energy to make energy. And this is really important because it's that law of thermodynamics all over again, right? Like energy cannot be created or destroyed. That's the first law. And as energy is transformed from one source to another, there are losses to thermal energy or degrading increase of entropy. All right. So why will energy return on energy investment be really high for coal? Well, because coal is super easy to dig out of the ground. And so the only energy we're spending to get that coal is the fossil fuels we burn on the big mining equipment, okay? Why is nuclear energy lower? Why do we get less energy returned from nuclear energy? It's because it's very expensive and energy intensive to mine uranium, contain uranium, build the plant, all of those kinds of things. And some fossil fuels have a lower EROI than renewables. Let's look. It has to do with the fact that like hydropower or tidal energy, it takes a lot of concrete to build a dam. It takes a lot of concrete to build a dam, and it takes a lot of energy. Concrete is one of the top 10 contributors of fossil fuel emissions. It's just concrete production. So building a dam is expensive at first and involves a lot of energy to invest in making it, and it takes a while to pay back. So that's what that EROI is. Yeah, keep asking questions, guys. Should we worry about designing an experiment FRQ over energy, or just propose a solution? You know, Tanya, I don't think you should worry about it either way. I think you should practice both. If you can think up an experimental design FRQ for energy, but apartment buildings roofs white, and then we measured how much energy they used for their air conditioners. And then we had a whole bunch of control apartments that were exactly the same, and we measured how much energy they used for air conditioning control to try and figure out, is painting your roof white a way to save energy? So there's an experiment, design over energy, and it also has to do with proposing a solution. I would be ready for both. How do you recommend getting better at experimental design FRQs, since there aren't too many practice experimental FRQs released? and that's from Charbel. We're going to look at one of the ones that they did release in a couple minutes. I will say data nuggets is a great way to look at other scientists' experiments, to go to data nuggets and read about their experiments. I would also watch the College Board YouTube videos, maybe on double speed. HHMI is also a great place. Howard Hughes Medical Institute. And they have a lot of videos on experiments. For example, the experiment that was College Board has used as an example question about bees and fungicide comes from Howard Hughes Medical Institute. And so I would watch maybe some short YouTube videos about experiments done. I was making environmental science field work or experiments. And familiarize yourself with other people's experiments. The other thing I would say is to make sure that you have your list of must-haves for an experiment. And I'll go way ahead because I don't want to bore you guys with stuff you don't want to know. Is that when you do your experimental design, have a checklist. Have a checklist that you're writing to make sure that you have described a measurable independent variable, a measurable dependent variable, constants, factors that do not change, a control in the experiment, and make sure that your hypothesis is measurable, testable, and results of a connection to a scientific idea. If, then, because is what I prefer. And then talk about how you would repeat it. It must be repeatable, or you want to have multiple plots. You don't want to think about, like, I'm just going to measure this. I'm just going to measure the number of nematodes in this plot next to the creek. You might want to think about, I'm going to measure this in 10 plots and a transect moving away from the creek, or I'm going to measure this over 10 years in 4 different locations. And in the environment, there's so many variables to control that you want to think about controlling as many of them in your designs by replicating things. And I think if you kind of go through that checklist, and then when you're writing your procedure, ask yourself, is the reader going to know what I mean or how to do it? For example, a lot of my students recently wrote about an acid rain experiment, and they said, measure the amount of acid precipitation. And that was very unclear, because did they mean measure the inches of acid precipitation? Or did they mean measure the pH of the acid precipitation? Or did they mean measure the frequency of times when there was pH below 4? Like, ask yourself, when you say what those variables are, how would I measure that? So hopefully that answered your question. I'm going to go over the phosphorus cycle. Let's see. It's back in big idea number 2. Okay, I only put the carbon cycle here. But what I'd like to talk about with the phosphorus cycle is that the things you need to remember about the phosphorus cycle. So this is just COVID the flu who asked this question. The phosphorus cycle is different than all cycles because it doesn't have an atmosphere component and grow a lot in. And so the thing that I think confuses people about the phosphorus cycle is, unlike nitrogen and carbon, it does not have a gaseous component. There is no PO2. There is no P2. So, right? Carbon cycle, the atmospheric component is CO2 stored through photosynthesis, stored through a biotic component. Nitrogen cycle, the predominant cycle there, the predominant part in the atmosphere is N2. It's 78% of the atmosphere is nitrogen. So why is it such a big problem for plants to get it? It's because in that format, thanks, Tanya, it's because without the bacteria and the nodules along plants, you can't make it into the form that is useful. So it has to be fixed into ammonia through ammonification. It has to be fixed into nitrate and nitrate. Then it's taken up and pooped out. Phosphorus is also taken up and pooped out. But it's not available unless it is weathered from rocks, dissolved in water, and then fixed by bacteria. So it can't come from the atmosphere at all. It can go back into the atmosphere as a solid, as particulates, but not as a gas. Okay? So hopefully that answered the question about phosphorus. You guys should definitely ask me more questions. One of the things I've done here is gone to big idea number 2, interactions between Earth systems. This relates a lot of the things we learn in Unit 1 and Unit 2 and Unit 3 to land use and some of the problems that we might be asked to solve in proposing a solution. So just like someone brought up earlier, understanding the carbon cycle helps you propose a solution to burning fossil fuels. The nitrogen and phosphorus cycles help you understand problems with eutrophication, where we have an excess of nutrients, or sometimes called nutrient pollutants, that lead to dead zones. And understanding the hydrologic cycle helps us understand why stormwater pollution is an issue in urban areas. When we get rid of our infiltration zone and we pave things over, now we have huge pulses of pollution running through our city when there's a big rain, washing off all those particulates and creating a pollution pulse. And overuse of aquifers, understanding that it takes thousands of years to replenish an aquifer. And so if we're going to draw it up pretty quickly for agriculture, that we need to conserve water, that even though it cycles, it is not truly renewable, that fresh water is a scarce resource. It's not inexhaustible. It is an exhaustible but renewable resource. So these cycles, I don't feel like you're going to need to memorize the details of them. I feel like you need to memorize them. You need to have reference to them as they relate to environmental problems that you're going to find solutions for, or as they relate to how you would set up an experiment. For example, if you're going to look at nitrogen fixation in a forest because of an invasive species eating all of the detritus and uncovering the soil, and you want to see how does that invasive species affect plant growth, nitrogen might be one thing that you measure. So please ask questions to get what you need. Great, here comes another question. Love me some questions. How does the carbon cycle play roles in the hydrologic cycle? That's a great question, Caitlin. For me, it's because surface runoff carries sediment into aquatic ecosystems. And so we have the deposition of carbon happens because of surface runoff. That's one of them. Another way that they're related is because if we have a drought, what's going to happen to photosynthesis? Photosynthesis is going to slow down, and that means carbon fixation from the atmosphere is going to slow down. Okay? So those are just 2 examples of how they're interrelated. I think you can probably just come up with some other ones, but those are the ones I come up with. Yep. Great. All right. I am going to move forward with big idea number 4, sustainability. And this one I have talked about a lot in previous live streams, but this big idea of sustainability links those environmental problems of when we disturb ecosystems, when we have invasive species introduced exotic species that outcompete others. When we have under beaches can provide advantages and disadvantages. And so here is a sample FRQ that has to do with sustainability. It has to do with Unit 1, aquatic ecosystems. It has to do with agricultural land use, Unit 5. And it's an example of what I think you might see in that you're provided an experiment that someone else has done, and you're asked to draw some conclusions from that data, and then you'll be asked to go further and think about how you would test it. So students in an environmental science class at Fremont High School tested water quality in a stream near their school. They were concerned about possible pollution of the stream, which flows through a farm on which hogs are raised. Shown below are a diagram that indicates the sites where the students collected water samples labeled A through D, and a table of the results in the students' water test. So you can see we're measuring dissolved oxygen. That relates to decomposers and eutrophication. When you have a lot of decomposition, those decomposers suck out all the oxygen. That's a problem for other consumers. Phosphate and nitrate, which in excess leads to eutrophication, and pH, which has to do with range of tolerance and biodiversity. Oh, I had slides on biodiversity review. I did not talk about those. You should ask questions about biodiversity if you want me to go back there. Okay, great. Overuse of aquifers, which are replenished in the first big idea. Okay, I'm going to go off script for a minute. Okay. This is the Oglala Aquifer. It is an underground aquifer. In other words, it's storing groundwater. Groundwater takes a huge, long time because it has to rain, infiltrate through the soil, infiltrate through those bedrock, and then while it's infiltrating, that's an ecosystem service, it's being purified. So this is very clean, very pure, fresh water that's sitting on need fast. Another is recharge. So I'm going to keep going with this unless you ask questions. Great. Biodiversity, with the laws of thermodynamics, the ones about the transfer of energy as heat so that no energy is lost or gained, in case that's the wrong name, be important to know. I don't really feel the laws of thermodynamics have much to do with biodiversity per se, but they do have to do with why we have this 10% rule. And they do have to do with why a species will be a keystone species. And understanding those interactions. Hold on. Understanding those interactions in biodiversity will help you understand why a species might become endangered, or why a species like the spotted owl or a sea otter becoming endangered is such a problem for an overall ecosystem, is because of that. Okay, so Tanya's commenting on the question. Oh, I thought that since the 10% rule relates to food pyramid and this relates to the 10% rule, this was biodiversity. Yes, so when we talk about biodiversity, we talk about populations that are interdependent or competing with each other. For example, we need there to be a large number of producers to support consumers. And so we want there to be a large biodiversity of grasses, in part because of that trophic pyramid, because of resilience to change. But I would say, yes, that they are tangentially related, really, Tanya, is what I would say. And the second law of thermodynamics, where energy is lost or degraded to a more chaotic state, in other words, thermal energy, every time it is transformed, that is the second law of thermodynamics. It doesn't relate as much. In your interactions between Earth systems in terms of biodiversity, we're concerned about three levels of biodiversity: genetic, species, and ecosystem diversity. And why do we care about these is because we need diversity to have resistance of an ecosystem to change, to have resilience, in other words, being bounce back after a hurricane, and we want. All right, that was a great question, and it looks like I have another question again. Okay, nope, same question. And so I did want to review for people. The ways that we measure biodiversity, because you may be asked that if you need to design an experiment that has to do with biodiversity. So species richness, the total number of each species; species abundance, the number of individuals of each species. So the species richness may be in this grassland ecosystem that I live in, there are 72 different species. But there are 100,000 grasshoppers and there's only 300 elk. So that's the species abundance. The relative abundance is the percentage of individuals of each species of the total number of living things. The Simpson's index is a way you put all those numbers together, but you won't be asked to do that. So I would have that at your fingertips, because if you're going to be asked to design an experiment that has to do with biodiversity, you need to know what these terms are. For example, there's a practice FRQ in the optional practice that has to do with native grasses in Hawaii. And most of my students did not understand some of the questions because they forgot what relative abundance was. Can we go over IPM and pest controls associated with it? Yes, I am going to stop sharing my screen because it is blurry. And I am going to, hold on. Forgot how to stop sharing my screen. I did it last time. Okay, here we go. IPM is integrated pest management. It means it's several different ways that you can bring together to avoid using chemical pesticides. That doesn't mean that you're avoiding using chemical pesticides altogether. Chemical pesticides are one part of IPM. But you're going to start with cultural control, intercrop pests, or pheromones. Okay. Nope. Come on. All right, so I'm going to share my screen about IPM. And because IPM is a data-based system, it makes for good experiments, because we're always trying to figure out how can we use physical controls, how can we use biological controls, how can we use these things in the right combination. There we go. In the right combination to avoid pesticides. I'm sorry, this is so stilted. So you'll see in this apps that are then rolling out control. Oof. Okay. Then we are bringing in chemicals at the last little bit. So understanding that those things need to be used together to avoid pesticides, and that we need to have a data-based approach, maybe even the timing of when we use those methods is critical to understanding. If we were asked to measure some air pollutant in the experiment, can we just say, measure the amount of air pollutant, or do we need to know a specific device that measures it? That's a good question. I don't think you would need to know that, for example, to measure VOCs, you have to put it through a gas chromatograph to analyze the concentration. But what you do want to say is kind of what your end measurement is. We're going to collect particulates and measure the mass of those particulates, or we're going to collect particulates from the air over this amount of time. And then we're going to separate out the sizes, because PM10 is not as bad for human health as PM 2.5. So I don't think you need to understand that you use a certain kind of optical thing to count the number of particulates, or that you need to know the chemical ways that we measure a gas in the air. But I do think you need to speak very specifically to, are you measuring the mass? Are you measuring the concentration? Are you categorizing? Are you measuring the different proportions of pollutants? Are you measuring how the concentration of that pollutant changes throughout the day, the difference between mass and concentration? Okay. And so I agree with Tanya. Thank you, Tanya. You're being awesome. All right. My screen is not working again. Going to try to close that screen and share it one more time. But in the meanwhile, you guys should ask questions. Okay, I see a question here. All right, and I'm back. All right, do you have any quick FRQ trips to help prepare during the exam if there aren't any other questions? There is no multiple choice part, Liam. You will have 2 FRQs. One will be shorter than the other. Pose a solution will be the first one. It will be 15 minutes. And then design and investigation will be about 25 minutes with uploads in between. And there's no multiple choice. And yes, I think it is really important I talk about tips and tricks. So one thing I would say is try not to use words like good for the environment, or bad for the environment, or harmful. Specific. When you cutting and pasting, how are you going to do that? Be prepared, practice it in advance. Have your experimental design checklist for that particular question. Remember, analysis, graphical trends that are positive, the line goes up as you go from left to right. They're negative when you go down from left to right. They may not have a clear trend. They may fluctuate. Describe the trend using actual numbers. Don't say it just increases. If you can say it increases 25 parts per million over the past 20 years, read the graph and quote numbers, cite numbers as evidence. I would say overall, the most important thing in an FRQ is to show your depth of knowledge. So if you write it quickly at first, then go back and check that you're using specific vocabulary and use your notes to build out the level of detail that shows that you're confident. Okay? Finally, remember, these are the two practices you will be asked to answer. Environmental solutions is the shorter question. So you probably will have to describe, and I will say describe is 3 to 4 sentences. Describe potential responses, and then when you pose a solution, you'll have to talk about economic, versus environmental ecosystem, and ideas as to how these things will be linking up so you can practice. And unless there are no other questions, that's what I got. Anybody have any last questions before we go here? All right, well, you've been really helpful in asking questions and helping each other review. I'm sorry for the technical difficulties, but I really appreciate the questions people asked. My last bit of advice to you would be, don't spend the entire exam like going through your notes. Trust yourself enough to get the original answers down there, and then use your notes to target the specific vocabulary or details that will make it a really good answer. Not a content question, but are you going to be at the 5-hour cram finale? I might just come and participate, but I am not one of the teachers doing that. But I tried to get myself in on that, but they already have a handle. So I will probably be in some of the chat at the end for sure. Thanks for asking. Do we need to know? Oh, it's fine. Please, Tanya. Anything for you. Do we need to know biomes? Sorry for asking so late. I want to, you want to know enough about that type of biome to be able to design an experiment. You want to also have some idea of what that climate is. So I would be familiar with, have pictures in your mind of the major biomes: chaparral or grassland, tropical rainforest, desert, tundra, taiga, deciduous forest ecosystem. And what are kind of the limiting factors in those ecosystems? For example, the limiting factors in grasslands is nutrients. So there's always a lack of nitrogen and phosphorus because there's so much fast cyclical plant growth. Same thing with rainforest soils because there's so much infiltration and so much photosynthesis. Limiting factor in a desert is obviously water. Limiting factor in the taiga and the tundra is topsoil and solar radiation and the canopy. So I think, honestly, you want to have kind of an idea of what kind of experiment would happen in all of those biomes. At least that you know what the limiting factors are and what the major ecosystem players are. Yeah, that would be helpful. Also would try to multiple units show good understanding of the content. That's why that in a think of that's useful. It's not useful to be like, this is an air pollution question and all I'm going to write is about air pollution. No, if it's an air pollution question, it might also be an ecosystem question. Why is acid precipitation so harmful to ecosystems? It might also be a soil question. Why does it create toxic levels of aluminum in the soil? It might also be an energy question. How can we prevent acid rain by reducing our reliance on coal, and what would be the solution to that? So you see how they're all interconnected, Tanya? And the only use of really being able to like identify whether it's unit 1, 2, 3, or 4 is so that you can quickly access some of the vocabulary or notes that you might need. So there's no math. Do we know? Okay, I'm going to just, okay, do not quote me. I heard secondhand there is no math. I'm not going to say for sure there is no math, but I would have a hard time imagining there is math. No, there is math. Everything I've heard is there is no math, but I would still have my equations there just in case. Do you need to know? Oh no, Tanya, keep going. I'm sorry. Do we need to know a lot about pH? Sorry about the last questions. Okay. So I would say you should know that pH 5 is 100 times worse than pH 7. You should know that acid rain is usually lower than pH. A little bit just to review it, not like that you're going to have to calculate how many times, hundreds of times more acidic something is, but that you do understand like pH 4 is not 1 time more acidic than pH 5. It's 10 times more acidic than pH 5. Okay. Great. All right, last chance. Questions and answers. All right. Well, we're over time. I will just say one last thing to the 11 of you people still there. You have learned a lot of things in APES, and the more you can relate them together, the more likely it is you're going to remember them on a meaningful level to show your level of knowledge. Also remember, they're specifically on purpose going to put more questions on there that you can even possibly answer in that time. Do not panic if you do not finish every part of every question. Just see how many parts there are, see if you can get to them all. And if you're stuck, make sure you have really strong ones, strong parts of that FRQ that show what you know, and then don't freak out. I'm so honored to teach you guys in this year where it's really challenging, and I'm really appreciative you guys are all going to go take that test, and good luck. Best of luck. Bye.